The moment Dakota Quinn saw the woman standing outside the mercantile in Utica, Montana territory, staring at nothing with eyes that held everything, he knew she carried secrets heavier than any saddlebag he had ever lifted. It was the summer of 1882, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street where she stood perfectly still, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Most folks walked past her without a second glance, but Dakota could not look away. There was something about the way she held herself, like a door that had been closed and locked from the inside, that made him want to understand what had happened to put that particular kind of silence in her eyes. He had ridden into town 3 days earlier, looking for work after spending 6 months driving cattle from Texas to Montana. The trail had been long and brutal, and he had lost 2 good friends to a river crossing gone wrong. At 24 years old, Dakota was tired of moving, tired of seeing nothing but the backside of cattle and endless prairie. He wanted to stay somewhere long enough to remember what his own bed felt like, to know his neighbors' names, to maybe find something worth staying for. Utica was not much to look at, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street, but it had a quietness to it that appealed to him after all those months of noise. The woman was still standing there when he finished loading supplies onto his horse. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a bun that had started to come loose. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he figured, though the look in her eyes made her seem ancient. Dakota walked over slowly, careful not to startle her. "Excuse me, miss," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you all right?" She turned to look at him then, and the impact of her gaze nearly knocked him backward. Her eyes were the color of a storm gathering over the mountains, gray and green and full of lightning that had nowhere to go. But she did not speak. She just looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, her steps quick and purposeful. "Do not bother with that one," said a voice behind him. Dakota turned to see the mercantile owner, a heavy-set man named George Patterson, standing in the doorway. "She does not talk to anyone, has not said a word since she got here 6 months ago." "What happened to her?" Dakota asked. George shrugged. "Nobody knows for certain. She came in on the stage coach with a family heading north to Homestead, but she was not with them, not really. They said they found her wandering alone near Fort Benton, half dead from exposure. She had no papers, no belongings, nothing. They brought her here because the wife's sister lives in Utica and thought maybe she could help. But the girl would not speak, would not write anything down, nothing. Doc examined her and said there was nothing wrong with her throat or anything physical. Said it was something in her mind, some kind of shock." Dakota watched the woman disappear around the corner of the hotel. "What is her name?" "Diana Patterson. My sister-in-law gave her the last name since she would not tell us hers." "Diana because that is what my niece wanted to call her, said she looked like a Princess Diana from some story book. The girl did not object, so that is what we call her." "Where does she stay?" "Works at the hotel, cleaning rooms in exchange for a bed in the attic. Mrs. Henderson says she is a good worker, never causes any trouble, just does her job and keeps to herself." George shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Some folks think she is simple in the head, but I do not think so. I have seen her eyes. There is plenty going on in there. She just cannot or will not let it out." Dakota nodded slowly, still looking at the spot where Diana had disappeared. Something pulled at him, something he could not name. He had always been good at reading people, at understanding what they meant even when their words said something different. His mother had been Crow Indian, and she had taught him to listen with more than just his ears before she died when he was 12. His father, a Irish immigrant turned cattleman, had taught him the value of patience and persistence. Maybe that combination was what made him think he might be able to reach this silent woman when nobody else could. He found work easily enough at the livery stable, which suited him fine. He was good with horses, and the owner, an older man named Thomas Reid, was happy to have the help. The pay was not much, but it came with a room in the back of the stable and meals at the boarding house down the street. Dakota settled into a routine quickly. He would work from dawn until late afternoon, taking care of the horses, repairing tack, and helping folks with their animals. In the evenings, he would clean up and walk into town, usually ending up at the hotel porch where he had taken to sitting and watching the world go by. It was on the third evening of this routine that Diana appeared again. She came out of the hotel carrying a basket of laundry, heading toward the creek that ran along the edge of town. Dakota stood up without thinking about it and followed at a distance. He did not want to frighten her, but he wanted to understand her, wanted to know what had stolen her voice. She walked with purpose, never looking back, her posture straight despite the heavy basket. At the creek, she knelt on the bank and began washing the linens with practiced efficiency. Dakota sat down on a fallen log about 20 feet away, close enough to see her but far enough not to intrude. He did not say anything, just sat there watching the water flow and listening to the birds settling in for the evening. After a while, Diana glanced over at him. Their eyes met, and he saw a flicker of something, curiosity maybe or confusion. But she did not leave. She went back to her washing, and Dakota stayed on his log. They remained like that until she finished her work and gathered up the wet laundry. As she stood to leave, Dakota spoke. "My mother used to say that silence is just another kind of language. You just have to learn how to speak it." Diana froze, her hands gripping the basket handles. She turned to look at him fully, and for the first time he saw something other than emptiness in her expression. It was fear, yes, but also a desperate kind of hope, like someone drowning who had just spotted a distant shore. Then she was gone, hurrying back toward town with her basket, leaving Dakota sitting by the creek as darkness fell. But he had seen that look, and it told him everything he needed to know. She wanted to be understood. She wanted someone to hear her. She just did not know how to let them in. The next evening, Dakota went back to the creek at the same time. Diana was there again with her laundry. This time, when she saw him, she did not seem surprised. He sat on the same log and pulled out his harmonica, something he had carried since his father gave it to him on his 15th birthday. He played softly, old songs his mother had sung to him, melodies that spoke of longing and loss and hope. He did not look at Diana while he played, did not want to make her feel watched. But he could feel her attention on him, could sense her listening with more than just her ears. When he finished the first song, he started another, and then another. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and still he played. When he finally stopped, the world had gone quiet except for the creek and the crickets. Diana was sitting now, her laundry finished and folded in the basket beside her. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, something soft and vulnerable and terrified all at once. "I will be here tomorrow evening if you want to listen again," Dakota said quietly. Then he stood and walked back to town, leaving her there in the gathering darkness. This became their routine. Every evening, Dakota would go to the creek and Diana would be there. Sometimes she brought laundry, sometimes mending, sometimes nothing at all. He would sit and play his harmonica, or sometimes he would just talk, telling her about his day, about the horses he worked with, about memories from his childhood. He never asked her questions, never pressed her to respond. He just offered his words and his music like gifts she could accept or refuse as she pleased. Slowly, incrementally, she began to change. It started with small things. She would sit a little closer each evening. She would stay a little longer. Sometimes he would catch her almost smiling at something he said, a ghost of an expression that disappeared as quickly as it came. 3 weeks into their evening meetings, something shifted. Dakota was telling her about a particularly stubborn mare he had been working with, how she refused to let anyone shoe her back hooves. "Reminds me of me when I was younger," he said with a laugh. "My father wanted to teach me bookkeeping for the ranch, said I needed to know more than just cattle and horses. I fought him on it for months, absolutely refused to sit still for those lessons. You know what changed my mind?" He paused, even though he knew she would not answer. It had become a habit, leaving space for her voice even though it never came. He stopped asking, just left the books on the kitchen table every morning and went about his day. Did not mention them, did not push, just left them there. After about a week, I got curious. Started looking at them when nobody was around. Turned out I actually liked numbers when nobody was forcing them on me. He glanced at Diana and found her watching him intently. Sometimes people need the space to come to things in their own time. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She reached out and touched his hand, just the lightest brush of her fingers against his knuckles, but it was deliberate and clear. "Thank you," that touch said. "I hear you." Dakota carefully turned his hand over, palm up, an offering. Diana looked at his hand for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were work-roughened and cold despite the warm evening, and they trembled slightly. He closed his hand gently around hers, not trapping but holding, letting her know she was not alone. They sat like that until full dark, not speaking, just being together in the quiet. When she finally pulled her hand away and gathered her things to leave, Dakota felt the loss of her touch like a physical ache. But he also felt something else: hope. The next day, Thomas Reed mentioned that he needed to make a trip to White Sulphur Springs to pick up some specialized equipment for the stable. "It is a 2-day ride there and back," he said. "I hate to close the stable, but I cannot avoid it." "I can handle things here," Dakota offered immediately. Thomas looked relieved. "You sure? It will be 5 days total. I will pay you extra, I am sure." That evening at the creek, Dakota told Diana about Thomas's trip. "I will be running the stable alone for the next 5 days," he said. "Means I might be a bit later getting here in the evenings. Hope you do not mind waiting." Diana's eyes widened slightly, and he realized what he had just implied. That their meetings mattered to him, that he planned to continue them no matter what, that she was important enough to rearrange his schedule for. A blush crept across her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. "You matter," Dakota said softly. "These evenings, they matter to me. I want you to know that." She looked up at him then with such raw emotion in her eyes that he almost could not breathe. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded carefully. She held it out to him with a shaking hand. Dakota took the paper gently and unfolded it. In careful, precise handwriting it said, "You matter to me too." His heart hammered in his chest as he read those 6 words over and over. She had written to him. After 6 months of complete silence, she had found a way to communicate with him. He looked up at her, and she was watching him with those storm-colored eyes, waiting to see how he would react. "Can I keep this?" he asked. She nodded, and this time the almost smile stayed on her face a little longer. "Will you write to me again, if there is something you want to say?" Another nod, more certain this time. "Diana," he said, testing her name on his tongue for the first time. She looked at him, and he saw acknowledgement in her eyes. "Is that really your name?" She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. She pulled out another piece of paper from her pocket, this one already prepared. She must have anticipated his question. The paper said, "I do not remember my name. Everything before is lost." "Before what?" Dakota asked gently. She flinched, her whole body going rigid. She stood up quickly, gathering her things with jerky, panicked movements. Dakota stood too, careful not to approach her. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I should not have pushed. Please do not go. I will not ask again." Diana paused, her back to him, her shoulders rising and falling with rapid breaths. Then, slowly, she turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening inside her, the desperate need to run fighting against the equally desperate need to be understood. Finally, she set her basket down and pulled out her small collection of papers and a pencil stub. She wrote quickly, her hand shaking so badly the words came out jagged. When she handed him the paper, it said, "I want to tell you I am afraid." "Of what?" Dakota asked, even though he thought he knew. She wrote again, "That you will look at me differently, that you will see me as broken." "Diana," he said, putting all the sincerity he possessed into his voice, "I already see you, and you are not broken. Hurt, yes. Changed by something terrible, probably, but not broken. You are still here, still trying, still surviving. That is not broken. That is strong." Tears spilled down her cheeks then, the first time he had seen her cry. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. Dakota wanted desperately to hold her, to offer comfort, but he knew it was too soon. Instead, he sat back down on the log and started playing his harmonica, a lullaby his mother used to sing, soft and gentle and safe. Gradually, Diana's sobs quieted. She sank down onto the ground, sitting in the grass with her knees pulled up to her chest. Dakota kept playing until the stars came out, until she had calmed completely. When he finally stopped, the night was deep and cool around them. "I should walk you back to the hotel," he said. "It is late." Diana nodded and gathered her things. They walked back to town in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This one felt shared, like a bridge they were building together, plank by plank. At the hotel steps, Diana turned to him. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, her face looked younger, less haunted. She touched her hand to her heart, then reached out and touched his chest, right over his heart. The gesture was clear. They were connected now, heart to heart. Dakota covered her hand with his, holding it there for just a moment. "Good night, Diana," he said softly. She pulled her hand away and went inside, but not before he saw the small, real smile that crossed her face. The next 5 days were the busiest of Dakota's life. Running the stable alone meant constant work from before sunrise until after dark. He barely had time to eat, let alone make it to the creek for their evening meetings. But every night, no matter how exhausted he was, he walked down to the water. Diana was always there waiting. She seemed to understand that he could not stay long, so she made the most of the time they had. She would hand him notes she had written during the day, little observations and thoughts. "The cardinal that lives in the oak tree by the hotel has babies now. I can hear them chirping. Mrs. Henderson made apple pie today. The whole hotel smelled like cinnamon. I saw you working with the black gelding this morning. You are very patient with him." Dakota treasured each note, keeping them in his shirt pocket close to his heart. He would raid them during the day when he needed a moment of rest, and each one made him smile. Through these small snippets, he was learning who Diana was beneath the silence. She was observant, noticing small details most people missed. She was kind, often writing about the good things people did. She had a quiet sense of humor, occasionally adding a wry comment that made him laugh out loud. On the 4th evening, when Dakota arrived at the creek dirty and exhausted from a difficult day, Diana was there with a plate of food covered with a cloth. She handed it to him without ceremony, and when he pulled back the cloth, he found fried chicken, biscuits, and green beans still warm. "Did you make this?" he asked, surprised. She shook her head and handed him a note. "Mrs. Henderson made it. I told her you were working too hard to eat properly. She said any man who spends his evenings playing harmonica for a silent woman deserves a good meal." Dakota laughed, a real belly laugh that felt good after the long, hard day. "So people know about our meetings?" Diana nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. She handed him another note. "It is a small town. Everyone knows everything. They think you are either very kind or very strange, maybe both." "What do you think?" Dakota asked, biting into the chicken. She wrote quickly, "I think you are the first person who has tried to understand me instead of fix me or feel sorry for me." Those words settled into Dakota's chest like a warm coal. "I do not think you need fixing," he said around a mouthful of biscuit. "Just understanding." They sat together while he ate, and Diana pulled out her mending. There was something deeply peaceful about the domesticity of it, like they were an old married couple comfortable in their routines. The thought sent a jolt through Dakota. When had this stopped being about helping a troubled woman and started being about something more? He looked at Diana in the fading light, really looked at her. The way the evening sun caught the golden strands in her hair, the concentration on her face as she worked her needle through the fabric, the delicate curve of her neck, the graceful movements of her hands. She was beautiful, he realized, not in a showy way but in a quiet, steady way that snuck up on you. As if sensing his gaze, Diana looked up. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. She looked away quickly, a blush spreading across her cheeks, but not before he saw the same awareness in her eyes. She felt it too, this thing growing between them. "Diana," he said softly, and she looked back at him. "I need to tell you something." She set down her mending, her full attention on him. "These evenings with you have become the best part of my days. I come here tired and dusty and worn down, and you make everything feel right again. I do not know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as someone who needed help and started thinking of you as someone I want to know for the rest of my life." He took a breath, gathering his courage. "I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since that first day I saw you outside the mercantile." Diana's eyes went wide, and her hand flew to her throat. She looked terrified and hopeful and overwhelmed all at once. She grabbed her paper and pencil, writing frantically, her hand shaking so hard she had to stop and start over several times. Finally, she thrust the paper at him. It said, "How can you love someone who cannot even speak, who does not know her own name, whose past is a blank wall? I have nothing to offer you. I am nobody." "That is not true," Dakota said firmly. "You are Diana, the woman who notices cardinals and baby birds, who works hard and never complains, who has somehow survived something terrible and still gets up every morning and keeps going, who writes me notes that make me smile even on the hardest days, who sits with me by this creek and makes silence feel like the most natural thing in the world. That is who you are, and that is who I love." Tears streamed down Diana's face again, but this time she was also smiling. She wrote quickly, "I am falling in love with you too. It terrifies me." "Why does it terrify you?" She wrote for a long time, the words coming in fits and starts. "Because loving someone means trusting them. And the last time I trusted someone, something terrible happened. I cannot remember what exactly, but my body remembers the fear. At night, I have nightmares where I am running and screaming but no sound comes out. I wake up choking on words I cannot say. Sometimes I think if I could just speak again, I could remember, but I cannot make my voice work. It is like something inside me is locked and I lost the key." Dakota read the note twice, his heart aching for her. Do you want to remember? She hesitated, then wrote, Yes and no. I think I need to remember to heal, but I am afraid of what I will find. Whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone, Dakota said. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Diana looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her making a decision. Then she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was an answer without words, a promise without voice. She was choosing to trust him, choosing to let him in despite her fear. They sat like that until the stars wheeled overhead, hands clasped, hearts opening to each other in the darkness. When Dakota finally walked her back to the hotel, he kissed her forehead gently before letting her go. She touched the spot where his lips had been, her eyes luminous in the lamplight, and then she was gone. Thomas returned the next day with the equipment and stories about his trip. Dakota listened and responded appropriately, but his mind was elsewhere. He could not stop thinking about Diana, about her words, about the trust she had placed in him. He wanted to help her unlock whatever was trapped inside, but he did not know how. He was just a cowboy who was good with horses, not a doctor or a miracle worker. That afternoon, an idea came to him while he was working with a skittish mare who had been abused by her previous owner. The horse would not let anyone touch her neck or her face, would panic and try to bolt at the slightest unexpected movement. Dakota had been working with her for weeks, moving slowly, speaking softly, letting her come to him instead of forcing anything. Today, she had finally let him touch her neck just for a moment before nervousness overtook her and she danced away. But it was progress. And it had happened because he had not pushed, had not forced, had simply created a safe space and waited for her to be ready. Maybe that was what Diana needed too. Not someone trying to fix her or unlock her or make her remember. Just someone who created a space safe enough that she could begin to heal in her own time, in her own way. That evening at the creek, Dakota brought his father's old journal, a leather-bound book filled with his father's thoughts and observations about ranching, life, and everything in between. My father wrote in this every night, Dakota told Diana as they sat together. He said writing helped him make sense of his thoughts, helped him see patterns he would miss otherwise. I thought maybe you would like to have a journal of your own, a place to put your thoughts when paper scraps are not enough. He held out a new journal he had bought at the mercantile, along with a proper pencil. Diana took it with reverent hands, running her fingers over the smooth leather cover. She opened it to the first page and wrote something, then showed it to him. Thank you. This is the nicest gift anyone has ever given me, at least that I can remember. You do not have to show me what you write, Dakota said. It is yours, private, but if you ever want to share something, I am here to read it. Diana nodded and tucked the journal against her chest like it was precious. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from repeated handling. She handed it to Dakota. He opened it carefully and found a drawing, rough but recognizable. It was him, sitting on the log by the creek with his harmonica, and the detail in the sketch showed that she had been watching him as carefully as he had been watching her. At the bottom, she had written, "This is how I see you. This is what safety looks like." Dakota felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Can I keep this too?" She nodded, smiling. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and grew. They still met every evening at the creek, but now they also saw each other during the day. Diana would bring lunch to the stable sometimes, and they would sit in the hay and eat together, communicating through her notes and his words. Dakota taught her to recognize different horse breeds and their temperaments. Diana showed him the garden behind the hotel that Mrs. Henderson had started, pointing out which herbs were good for cooking and which for medicine. The town gradually accepted their unusual courtship. At first, there had been whispers and speculation, But Dakota's steady devotion and Diana's gentle presence eventually won people over. Mrs. Henderson became Diana's fierce protector, making it clear that anyone who had unkind words to say about the silent woman could find somewhere else to stay. George Patterson at the Mercantile started setting aside small luxuries for Diana, ribbon or hard candy, refusing payment and waving away her protestations. One Sunday, Dakota worked up the courage to invite Diana to church. She looked terrified at the prospect, but she also nodded acceptance. They sat in the back pew together, and when the congregation sang hymns, Dakota sang quietly beside her while Diana mouthed the words, no sound emerging. But her eyes were closed and her face was peaceful, and Dakota thought she had never looked more beautiful. After the service, several townspeople made a point of greeting Diana warmly, and she responded with nods and small smiles. An older woman named Martha Quinn, no relation to Dakota despite the shared name, took Diana's hands and said, "I lost my voice for 2 years after my son died. Everyone said I would never speak again. But one day the words just came back like a dam breaking. I pray that happens for you, dear. But even if it does not, you have found a good man in Dakota here. Hold on to him." Diana squeezed the woman's hands, her eyes bright with tears, and nodded. That evening at the creek, Diana wrote in her journal for a long time while Dakota played his harmonica. When she finally closed the book, she tore out a page and handed it to him. It was longer than her usual notes. "Today at church, I felt something shift inside me. Not my voice coming back, but something else. I realized that I have been waiting to heal before I let myself live. But maybe healing does not work that way. Maybe you heal by living, by letting yourself love and be loved, by taking risks and trusting people even when you are afraid. You have taught me that. You have shown me that I can be me, silent and damaged and incomplete, and still be worth loving. That is a gift beyond measure. I want you to know that no matter what happens, whether my voice comes back or not, whether I remember my past or not, I choose you. I choose this. I choose us." Dakota read the note 3 times, his vision blurring with tears. Then he set it aside carefully and turned to Diana. "May I kiss you?" She looked at him with those storm-colored eyes, and he saw fear there, yes, but also desire and trust. She nodded slowly. Dakota leaned in carefully, giving her plenty of time to change her mind to pull away. But she did not. She stayed perfectly still, barely breathing as his lips met hers. The kiss was soft and gentle, a question and an answer all at once. Dakota cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, and Diana's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palms. When they finally parted, Diana was trembling. But she was also smiling, a real, full smile that transformed her whole face. She touched her fingers to her lips, then to his, a gesture of wonder. "I love you," Dakota said simply. "I want to marry you if you will have me. I know it is fast, I know there is much we still need to figure out, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Diana grabbed her journal and wrote frantically. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, but I need to tell you something first. I need to try to write down what I can remember, what my nightmares show me. You need to know what you are taking on." "You do not have to," Dakota started, but Diana shook her head firmly. She wrote, "I do. For me and for you, wait here." She stood and hurried back toward town, leaving Dakota sitting by the creek in confusion. She returned 20 minutes later with her journal and a lantern. She sat down beside him, lit the lantern as darkness fell, and began to write. Dakota sat quietly, watching the concentration on her face, the way she would sometimes stop and close her eyes as if seeing something in her mind. The process took over an hour. Finally, she handed him the journal, Open to the pages she had filled, in the lamplight, Dakota read Diana's story, pieced together from nightmares and fragments and feelings. I think I was traveling with my family. Parents, maybe a brother, I am not sure. We were going west, looking for land or a new start. There were others with us, other families in wagons. I remember feeling excited, like this was an adventure. I think I was 18, maybe 19. Old enough to help with the work, but young enough to still believe the world was basically good. Then there was an attack. I think it was bandits, but I am not certain. Men with guns and angry voices. There was shooting. Someone grabbed me, dragged me away from the wagon. I remember screaming and screaming, but nobody came. I remember hiding in tall grass, watching smoke rise from our camp. I remember waiting for someone to come find me, but nobody did. After that, it gets fuzzy. I was alone. I walked for days, maybe weeks. I drank from streams and ate berries and roots. I think I wanted to die. I remember lying down under a tree and hoping I would just not wake up. But I did wake up, and there were people there, the family who brought me to Utica. They were kind, but by then I could not speak anymore. The words were just gone, locked away somewhere. I could not reach them. I do not know what happened to my family. I do not know if they survived or if I am the only one left. I do not know my real name or where I came from. All I know is that for 6 months I have been nobody, going through motions of living without really being alive, until you made me want to live again. You made me believe I could be someone, even without a voice, even without a past. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. Dakota finished reading and carefully set the journal aside. Then he pulled Diana into his arms, holding her tight against his chest while she cried silently, her body shaking with sobs. He stroked her hair and rocked her gently, letting her release all the pain and fear she had been carrying. "I am so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I am so sorry that happened to you. But you survived. You are here. You are strong and brave and incredible, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel alone or afraid again." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other beside the creek while the stars wheeled overhead. When Diana finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but she also looked lighter somehow, like she had set down a burden she had been carrying too long. She picked up her journal and wrote, "Will you help me try to find out what happened to my family? I know it might be impossible, but I need to try. I need to know if anyone else survived." "Of course," Dakota said immediately. "We will go to Fort Benton, talk to the authorities there, see what we can find out. Whatever you need, I am with you." Diana leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in silence, watching the moon rise over the mountains. For the first time since he had met her, Dakota felt like he was seeing Diana whole, not just the silent, haunted woman, but the survivor, the fighter, the woman who had endured hell and come out the other side. The next morning, Dakota talked to Thomas about taking time off. "I need to go to Fort Benton with Diana. It is important." Thomas, who had grown fond of Diana during her lunch visits to the stable, nodded immediately. "Take as long as you need. Young love should not be put on hold for horseshoeing. Just be back before winter sets in hard. That is when business picks up with folks needing their animals shod for the snow." "We will be back in 2 weeks, 3 at most," Dakota promised. They left on a Monday morning in early September. Dakota borrowed a wagon and a steady team from Thomas, and Mrs. Henderson packed them enough food for a week. Diana wore her best dress and carried a small bag with her few belongings, including her journal. As they rolled out of Utica, several townspeople waved goodbye, and Diana waved back, no longer hiding in the shadows. The journey to Fort Benton took 3 days of steady travel. They camped beside the trail at night, and Dakota taught Diana to build a fire and cook over it. She was a quick learner, watching everything he did and replicating it carefully. In the evenings, she would write in her journal while he tended the horses, and sometimes she would share what she had written. Mostly it was observations about the landscape or thoughts about their future together. Once, she wrote a description of how she felt when he kissed her that made him blush to his roots and pull her into his arms for another kiss. Fort Benton was a bustling trading post on the Missouri River, much larger than Utica. Dakota found them a room at a modest hotel, and the next morning they went to see the Army commander. Captain William Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s who listened to their story with growing sympathy. "There were several attacks on wagon trains in this area last spring," he said. "The Sioux were active then, unhappy about miners moving through their territory. We also had reports of outlaw gangs preying on travelers. Do you remember what month this was, miss?" Diana wrote. "Early spring, I think. There was still snow on the ground in shaded areas. Maybe April." Morrison nodded. "There was a bad attack in mid-April about 40 miles south of here. A wagon train of maybe 8 or 9 families. We sent soldiers when we got word, but by the time we arrived, most of the folks were dead. We found 3 survivors hiding in the brush, 2 women and a boy. They said some people had run when the shooting started, and we searched for days but never found anyone else alive." Diana grabbed Dakota's hand so hard it hurt. She wrote with her other hand, "What happened to the survivors? Where are they?" The 2 women were sisters. Both lost their husbands in the attack. They stayed here at the fort for a few weeks, then moved on. I think they went to Helena maybe, but trying to start over. The boy was about 12, I think. He was wounded pretty bad. Doc did his best, but the infection took him about a week after we brought him in. Poor kid." Morrison looked at Diana with deep sadness. "Were you with that group, miss?" Diana nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Then I am deeply sorry for your loss. We tried to find everyone, truly we did. But the prairie is vast, and if you were hiding or running, it is a miracle you survived at all." Dakota put his arm around Diana as she cried. "Can you tell us anything about the people who died? Were there any young women among them?" Morrison went to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "We tried to identify everyone, but it was not always possible. Let me see." He flipped through papers. "We buried 14 people total. 6 men, 5 women, 3 children. The women ranged in age from mid-20s to about 50. Most were too badly burned or damaged to identify clearly, but the survivors told us who they thought everyone was." He pulled out a list and handed it to Dakota. "These are the names the survivors gave us. Maybe seeing them will help jog your memory, miss." Diana took the paper with shaking hands. She read through the list slowly, her finger tracing each name. About halfway down, she stopped. Her whole body went rigid and a sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob. She pointed at 2 names, Robert and Margaret Phillips, listed as husband and wife, both deceased. "You knew them?" Morrison asked gently. Diana nodded frantically. She wrote in her journal, "I think those were my parents. When I see those names, something inside me screams yes. Margaret. That name, I think maybe I called her mother." "There was a younger fellow listed as their son," Morrison said, checking his notes. "James Phillips, age 16. He was among the dead as well. I am sorry." Diana crumpled then, folding in on herself as grief washed over her. Dakota held her while she cried, and Captain Morrison tactfully left the room to give them privacy. They stayed like that for a long time, Diana mourning the family she could barely remember but knew she had lost. When she finally calmed enough to write again, she asked, "Can you take me to where they are buried?" Dakota looked at Morrison, who had returned. "Is that possible? We buried them at the fort cemetery. I can show you, Morrison said. They followed him to a small, fenced cemetery on a hill overlooking the river. Morrison led them to a section with several simple wooden crosses, all dated April 1882. 3 crosses stood together, marked with the names Robert Phillips, Margaret Phillips, and James Phillips. Diana knelt in front of the graves and placed her hand on the earth. Dakota knelt beside her, his hand on her back, offering silent support. She stayed there for a long time, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a goodbye. Finally, she pulled out her journal and wrote, "I want to put real headstones here. They deserve to be remembered properly." "We can arrange that," Dakota said. "We will go into town and order headstones from the mason, whatever you want." Over the next 2 days, they worked with a local stonemason to design 3 simple but dignified headstones. Diana insisted on paying for them with money she had saved from her work at the hotel, and she carefully wrote out what she wanted each stone to say. For her mother's, she wrote, "Margaret Phillips, beloved mother taken too soon." For her father's, "Robert Phillips, devoted father and husband, rest in peace." For her brothers, "James Phillips, cherished son and brother, forever young." The mason promised the stones would be ready in 6 weeks and would be installed before the first snow. Dakota paid extra to have him send word to Utica when the work was done, and Diana wrote out a note to be included with the message, thanking him for honoring her family's memory. With that settled, they spent another day at the fort, and Dakota helped Diana gather what information he could about her family's past. According to the survivors Captain Morrison had interviewed, the Phillips family had been traveling from Missouri to Montana Territory, hoping to homestead. Robert had been a carpenter and Margaret a teacher. James had been their only child, or so the survivors remembered, but Diana's name had never come up. "It is possible you were not traveling with your parents directly," Morrison suggested. "Maybe you had joined the wagon train separately, or maybe you were with extended family, and the survivors just did not know about you. In big wagon trains, people sometimes do not know everyone in the group." Diana wrote, "I think maybe I was engaged to someone in another family. I keep having flashes of a young man with red hair, but I cannot see his face clearly. Maybe he was one of the dead too." Morrison checked his list. There was a red-haired fellow, unmarried, age about 20, name of Thomas Crane. He was traveling with his parents and 2 younger sisters. His whole family died in the attack. Diana stared at the name for a long time, then nodded slowly. "I think that was him. I think we were going to be married." Dakota felt a pang of jealousy, which he immediately felt ashamed of. This Thomas Crane was long dead, and whatever Diana had felt for him was buried with him. But he could not help feeling like he was competing with a ghost. As if sensing his thoughts, Diana reached over and took his hand. She wrote, "That was another life, another me. I cannot even remember his face clearly, but I remember yours. I love you, Dakota Quinn. Not the ghost of who I was, but the woman I am now. You saved me." "You saved yourself," Dakota said. "I just walked beside you while you did it." They left Fort Benton the next morning, heading back to Utica. The journey back was quieter than the journey there. Diana seemed lost in thought much of the time, staring at the passing landscape with an expression Dakota could not read. He worried that learning the truth had hurt her more than helped her. But on the second night, as they sat by their campfire, Diana pulled out her journal and wrote for a long time. When she finished, she handed it to Dakota. The entry was long, several pages, and he read it carefully in the firelight. "I thought knowing the truth would destroy me. I thought the pain of confirmed loss would be more than I could bear. But instead, I feel lighter. For 6 months I have been haunted by not knowing, by the terrible possibilities that played out in my mind. At least now I know. My family is gone. The man I was supposed to marry is gone. That chapter of my life is closed forever. It is strange to mourn people I cannot fully remember. I look at their names and feel grief, but it is like grieving for strangers. The Diana Phillips, who was their daughter and sister, died on that prairie with them. The woman I am now is someone different, someone shaped by survival and silence and finally by love. I have decided something. I want to keep the name Diana. Not Diana Phillips, that girl is gone. Diana Patterson was the name I was given when I was nobody. But Diana Quinn, that is who I want to be. That is the woman I am choosing to become. If you still want to marry me, Dakota, I want to take your name and build a new life with you. I cannot give you my past because I have lost it, but I can give you my future, all of it, for as long as we both live. Dakota looked up from the journal to find Diana watching him anxiously. Diana Quinn, he said, testing the name. That sounds perfect. Her face lit up with a smile so bright it rivaled the fire. She moved around the fire to sit beside him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head on his chest, right over his heart, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the flames dance and planning their future in comfortable silence. They arrived back in Utica to find the town preparing for the Autumn Harvest Festival. Mrs. Henderson greeted them with enthusiasm, hugging Diana and demanding to know everything about their trip. When Diana showed her the journal pages about finding her family's graves, Mrs. Henderson cried and hugged Diana even tighter. "You are home now," the older woman said firmly. "Utica is your home and we are your family. Never forget that." Dakota went to Thomas to report for work, but Thomas waved him off. "Take another few days to settle. You both need rest after that journey. Come back Monday and we will get back to routine." That evening, Dakota and Diana walked to their creek. It felt like coming home, sitting on their log with the water flowing past and the familiar trees surrounding them. Dakota played his harmonica while Diana wrote in her journal, and everything felt right with the world. After a while, Diana stopped writing and tapped Dakota on the shoulder. When he looked at her, she handed him a note. "When should we get married?" "Whenever you want," Dakota said. "Tomorrow, next month, next year, I am yours whenever you are ready," she wrote. "I want to marry before winter. I want to start our life together as soon as possible, but I need to make a dress, and we need to find a place to live. The hotel attic is not big enough for 2 people. I have been saving money," Dakota said. "Not a lot, but enough. There is a small house on the edge of town that old Mrs. Crawford used to live in. She passed away last month and her son is looking to sell it. It is nothing fancy, but it has 2 rooms and a root cellar. We could make it work." Diana's eyes lit up. She wrote, "Can we go see it?" They went immediately, even though the sun was setting. The house was indeed small. A simple wooden structure with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom, and a narrow porch. But it had good bones, and someone had clearly loved it once. There was a small vegetable garden out back, overgrown now but recoverable, and a sturdy shed for storage. "What do you think?" Dakota asked, watching Diana explore every corner. She came back to him with her journal. "It is perfect. It is ours. A blank slate like us. We can make it into whatever we want it to be." Dakota smiled. "Then I will talk to Crawford's son tomorrow and make an offer." The next 6 weeks flew by in a flurry of activity. Dakota bought the house for a fair price, and immediately the town rallied to help them make it livable. Thomas and some other men helped repair the roof and reinforce the porch. Mrs. Henderson organized the women to clean and scrub every surface until it shone. Diana and some of the younger women tackled the garden, cutting back the weeds and preparing the soil for spring planting. George Patterson donated paint from the mercantile. and Diana chose a warm yellow for the kitchen walls. She and Dakota spent a whole day painting, and by the end they were both speckled with yellow and laughing at each other's appearance. Dakota chased her around the house with a paintbrush, threatening to paint her nose, and Diana ran squealing silent laughter, her eyes bright with joy. "I think this is the happiest I have ever seen you," Dakota said when he finally caught her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Diana turned in his arms and kissed him, a long, deep kiss that left them both breathless. When she pulled back, she wrote quickly, "I did not know I could be this happy. I did not know life could be this good." "This is just the beginning," Dakota promised, Mrs. Henderson helped Diana sew a wedding dress, using fabric donated by several townswomen. It was simple but lovely, made of cream-colored cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Diana spent hours embroidering small flowers along the hem, her work meticulous and beautiful. They set the wedding date for the first Saturday in November, right after the harvest was in, but before the winter snows began. The whole town was invited, and the ceremony would be held at the church with a reception in the town hall afterward. A week before the wedding, a telegram arrived at the Mercantile from Fort Benton. The headstones were installed, and Captain Morrison sent his congratulations on their upcoming marriage. Diana cried when she read the message, but they were happy tears. Her family had been honored, and now she could move forward. The night before the wedding, Dakota stayed at the boarding house while Diana stayed with Mrs. Henderson at the hotel. It was tradition not to see each other before the ceremony, though Dakota found it nearly impossible to stay away. He lay awake most of the night, simultaneously excited and terrified. What if she changed her mind? What if she realized she deserved better than a simple, stable hand? What if her voice came back and she decided she did not need him anymore? But when he arrived at the church the next morning and saw Diana standing at the back in her wedding dress, every fear evaporated. She was radiant, her hair done up with small white flowers woven through it, her eyes shining as she looked at him. Mrs. Henderson stood beside her, playing the role of mother since Diana's own mother could not be there. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Pastor Williams, who had been briefed on Diana's situation, had modified the vows so that Diana could respond by nodding instead of speaking. When he asked if she took Dakota to be her husband, to love and cherish in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them, Diana nodded so emphatically that the whole congregation laughed gently. Dakota spoke his vows clearly, his voice strong despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I take you, Diana, to be my wife. I promise to love you, to listen to you in whatever way you need to be heard, to stand beside you in joy and in sorrow, to build a life with you that honors both where we have been and where we are going. You are my heart, my home, my everything. I am yours for as long as we both shall live." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife and told Dakota he could kiss his bride, the kiss was tender and sweet, a promise of all the kisses to come. The congregation erupted in applause, and Diana turned to face them with a smile so wide and genuine that several people wiped away tears. The reception was a joyful affair. Someone had decorated the town hall with autumn leaves and wildflowers, and Mrs. Henderson had coordinated a feast that seemed impossible for such a small town to produce. There was roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread, vegetables in every preparation imaginable, and at least 6 different kinds of pie. Dakota and Diana had their first dance to a fiddle player's tune, and even though Diana could not hear the music in the traditional sense, she followed Dakota's lead perfectly. They moved together like they had been dancing for years, and watching them, Several unmarried young women sighed wistfully while their mothers smiled knowingly. As the evening wore on and people began to drift home, Thomas Reed approached Dakota. "I have a wedding gift for you both," he said. "I am not getting any younger, and I have been thinking about what comes next. How would you feel about becoming a partner in the stable? I will still run things day to day, but you would own half the business. Eventually, when I retire, it would all be yours." Dakota was stunned. "Thomas, I do not know what to say. That is incredibly generous. You are a hard worker and good with the animals. More importantly, you are a good man. This town needs more men like you, and I want to make sure you have a reason to stay." Thomas glanced at Diana, who was across the room with Mrs. Henderson. "Besides, that girl has had enough instability in her life. Time someone gave her roots." Dakota shook Thomas's hand firmly. "I accept, and thank you. This means more than you know." He told Diana later that night, after they had gone to their new home and closed the door on the world. Diana cried and hugged him and wrote, "We have a home, a business, a life. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." They stood in the middle of their kitchen, still decorated with the flowers and ribbons from the wedding, and Dakota pulled Diana close. "This is our beginning," he said softly. "Everything that came before, all the pain and loss, it brought us to this moment. And I would walk through fire to get here again." Diana pulled out a piece of paper she had tucked into her dress pocket. She handed it to Dakota, and by the lamplight he read, "I have been trying to speak again. Trying so hard. I want to tell you with words how much I love you, but the words still will not come. I am sorry." "Do not be sorry," Dakota said, cupping her face in his hands. "I hear you, Diana. I hear everything you never say aloud. I hear it in the way you look at me. I hear it in how you touch my hand. I hear it in every note you write, every smile you give me. You do not need words for me to know exactly how you feel." She kissed him then, and the kiss was different from all the others. This one spoke of forever, of promises kept and futures shared, of two broken people who had found each other and become whole. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dakota picked her up and carried her to their bedroom, crossing the threshold into their new life together. Winter came to Montana territory with its usual ferocity, but inside the little yellow house, everything was warm. Dakota worked at the stable 6 days a week, and business was good enough that he could afford to hire a young man to help with the heavy work. Diana kept the house, tended to their needs, and started helping Mrs. Henderson at the hotel again. Though now she only worked 3 days a week, in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Dakota would read aloud from books they borrowed from the few people in town who owned them. Diana loved stories, and she would sit with her mending or her journal, listening with rapt attention. Sometimes she would write her reactions to the stories, and Dakota loved seeing how her mind worked, what details she noticed, what moved her. In January, Diana started feeling ill in the mornings. Mrs. Henderson took one look at her and immediately knew what was happening. When she told Diana she was likely pregnant, Diana's reaction was complex. She was overjoyed but also terrified. She wrote pages in her journal about her fears. What if she could not be a good mother without a voice? What if the baby needed her to speak and she could not? What if she failed her child the way she felt she had failed to save her family? Dakota read her fears and held her while she cried. "You will be an amazing mother," he assured her. "Look at how you communicate with everyone around you. Look at how you make yourself understood. Our child will grow up knowing that love is more than words, that connection runs deeper than speech. You will teach them that through your own example." As Diana's pregnancy progressed, something unexpected happened. She started making sounds again. Not words, but small noises, humming while she worked, a soft laugh when Dakota tickled her, a gasp when the baby kicked hard. It was as if becoming a mother was slowly unlocking something inside her that had been sealed shut. One evening in late spring, when Diana was about 7 months pregnant and moving more slowly, they were sitting on their porch watching the sunset. Dakota had his arm around her shoulders, and her hand rested on her swollen belly. Suddenly, she grabbed his hand and pressed it to her stomach. "Feel that?" she said, and then froze, her eyes going wide with shock. Dakota froze too. "Diana," he whispered, "did you just—" "I spoke," she breathed, and this time he definitely heard it, rough and rusty from disuse but unmistakable. "I spoke. Dakota, I spoke." She burst into tears, and Dakota held her while she cried and laughed simultaneously. She kept saying his name over and over. "Dakota, Dakota, Dakota," like she was testing out the sound of her own voice, reclaiming it word by word. "Tell me you love me," Dakota said, his own voice choked with emotion. "Please, I need to hear you say it." "I love you," Diana said, the words slow and careful but clear. "I love you so much." They kissed and cried and laughed, and the baby kicked between them as if celebrating too. When they finally pulled apart, Diana touched her throat wonderingly. "It feels strange," she said. "Like I forgot how to use my voice and now I am remembering. But it is there. It is really there." Over the next few weeks, Diana practiced speaking constantly. At first the words came slowly and she tired easily, her throat sore from the unaccustomed use. But gradually, it got easier. She spoke in short sentences at first, then longer ones. She went to town and spoke to Mrs. Henderson, who cried and hugged her and praised God for miracles. She spoke to George Patterson and thanked him for his kindness. She spoke to Pastor Williams and told him how his sermons had helped her even when she could not respond. The whole town celebrated Diana's recovery. But interestingly, Dakota found that he missed some aspects of their silent communication. There had been something intimate about their private language of notes and glances. Diana must have felt the same because she still wrote him notes sometimes, especially when she wanted to say something particularly meaningful. One evening, she handed him a note that said, "Thank you for hearing me when I could not speak. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for loving me before I could say I loved you back. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Dakota said, pulling her into his arms as much as her pregnant belly would allow. "Before you, I was just drifting. You gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build something lasting. You gave me home." In July, Diana went into labor on a hot afternoon when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Dakota ran to get Mrs. Henderson and the doctor, and then spent the next 12 hours pacing outside the bedroom while Diana labored. He could hear her crying out, and every sound pierced his heart. He wanted to be with her, but Mrs. Henderson had firmly ordered him to stay out. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a different cry, thin and reedy and absolutely perfect. The bedroom door opened and Mrs. Henderson emerged, exhausted but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is asking for you." Dakota practically ran into the room. Diana was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but she was smiling as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when Dakota entered, and her smile grew wider. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Dakota approached carefully, almost afraid to breathe. Diana pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny, wrinkled face with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on the world. He was perfect. "Can I hold him?" Dakota asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Diana carefully transferred the baby to Dakota's arms, and the moment his son settled against his chest, Dakota felt his whole world shift and resettle. This was what mattered. This was what everything had been leading to. His wife and his child, his family, his life. What should we name him? Diana asked. Dakota had been thinking about this for months. What about Daniel, Daniel Patrick Quinn? Diana smiled. Daniel, I like that. Strong and simple. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world, little one. Baby Daniel scrunched up his face and let out a wail, and both his parents laughed. Life had officially begun. The first year of Daniel's life was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Dakota had never known he could function on so little sleep, but somehow he managed. He worked at the stable during the day while Diana cared for Daniel at home, and in the evenings he would take over baby duty so Diana could rest. They developed a rhythm, a partnership that worked because they had learned to communicate so deeply during Diana's silent months. When Daniel was about 9 months old and starting to pull himself up on furniture, Dakota came home one evening to find Diana sitting on the floor with their son, tears streaming down her face. He immediately dropped to his knees beside them. What is wrong? Is Daniel okay? He is fine, Diana said, wiping at her cheeks. I am fine. I am just overwhelmed with gratitude. Look at him, Dakota. Look at our beautiful boy. 2 years ago, I was a shell of a person, unable to speak, barely surviving. And now I have this perfect child, and you, and a home, and a life I never dreamed possible. How did I get so lucky? We both got lucky, Dakota said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and using his free hand to ruffle Daniel's dark hair. We found each other when we both needed finding. As Daniel grew into a toddler, he proved to be a happy, curious child who loved animals and had inherited his father's way with horses. By the time he was 3, he was already spending time at the stable, carefully supervised, feeding the horses carrots and learning their names. He was also learning to read, with both his parents teaching him, and he showed his mother's love of stories. One evening, when Daniel was 4 years old, he asked a question that stopped both his parents in their tracks. Mama, why do you write notes to Papa sometimes instead of talking? Diana and Dakota exchanged glances. They had known this conversation would come eventually, but they had not quite prepared for it. Diana knelt down to be at eye level with her son. When I first met your father, she said carefully, I could not talk. Something very sad had happened to me, and my voice stopped working. Your father learned to understand me anyway, without words. We still write notes sometimes because it reminds us of how we learned to hear each other's hearts. What sad thing happened? Daniel asked with a child's innocent directness. My first family died, Diana said simply. There was no point in hiding the truth. Daniel would learn it eventually. I was very young and we were traveling and bad people hurt them. I survived, but I lost my voice from being so scared and sad. But then I met your father and he helped me find my voice again. And then we had you and you made everything better. Daniel processed this seriously. So Papa saved you. We saved each other, Dakota said, sitting down beside them. Your mama gave me a reason to stay in one place and build a life. I gave her a safe place to heal. That is what people who love each other do. They help each other be stronger. Daniel nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. I love you, Mama and Papa. We love you too, sweetheart, Diana said, pulling him into a hug. Over his head, she met Dakota's eyes, and the look they shared held everything. Grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been found, and hope for what was yet to come. 2 years later, Diana gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Dorothy Ann. She had her mother's storm-colored eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the moment she was born, she had a fierce, determined personality. Where Daniel was gentle and thoughtful, Dorothy was bold and adventurous. She kept them on their toes, climbing everything, getting into everything, afraid of nothing. She is going to give us gray hair, Dakota said one evening after rescuing 3-year-old Dorothy from the top of the stables, hay stack for the 4th time that week. She reminds me of how I imagine my brother James was, Diana said, watching their daughter run off to her next adventure. Mrs. Henderson says I was shy as a child before, but I think maybe I was bolder too once. Maybe Dorothy is showing me who I might have been if life had been kinder. I like who you are, Dakota said, sliding an arm around her waist. I would not change a single thing about you. Diana leaned into him. Even my years of silence, especially those, Dakota said seriously. They taught me how to really listen, how to see beyond words to what people truly mean. That has made me a better husband, a better father, a better person. Everything we went through, hard as it was, made us who we are. I would not trade that for anything. As the years passed, the Quinn family became pillars of the Utica community. Dakota eventually took over the stable completely when Thomas finally retired, and he built it into a thriving business. Diana became known for her work with children who had experienced trauma, using her own experience to help others find ways to communicate and heal. She never formally trained as a teacher or counselor, but people brought their troubled children to her anyway, knowing she understood in a way others could not. Daniel grew into a tall, quiet young man who loved books and horses in equal measure. He attended the small school in Utica and showed such promise that by the time he was 15, the teacher was encouraging him to consider going to a real university back east. Diana was torn between pride and fear at the thought of her son leaving, but she and Dakota agreed they would support whatever Daniel chose. Dorothy, meanwhile, became the town's most accomplished young horsewoman. By age 12, she could outride most of the men, and she had a gift for training difficult horses. She worked alongside her father at the stable and made it clear she had no intention of ever leaving Montana territory. "Why would I want to be anywhere else?" she would say. "Everything I love is right here." On their 15th wedding anniversary, Dakota took Diana back to the creek where they had first really met, where he had played his harmonica and she had begun to trust again. The town had grown over the years, but this spot remained unchanged, still quiet and peaceful and theirs. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Dakota asked as they sat on what they still thought of as their log, even though it was now weathered and moss-covered. "Every detail," Diana said. "I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I had ever met or completely insane for wasting your time on a broken woman who could not even speak." "You were never broken," Dakota said firmly, as he had said so many times over the years. "Hurt, yes. Lost, certainly, but not broken." "I know that now," Diana said. "You taught me that. You taught me that trauma does not define us, that we are more than the worst things that have happened to us." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I wish I could go back and tell that silent, terrified woman standing outside the mercantile that everything was going to be all right, that she would find love and safety and a life beyond anything she could imagine. She found it because she was brave enough to keep trying," Dakota said. "You survived something that would have destroyed most people. You found ways to communicate when your voice was gone. You built a new life from nothing. That took incredible courage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water flow past just as it had 15 years earlier. Finally, Diana spoke again. "Do you ever wonder about the life I had before? The Diana Phillips who died on that prairie?" "Sometimes," Dakota admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it, that Diana is gone and I never knew her. I know you, Diana Quinn. You are the woman I fell in love with, the woman I married, the mother of my children. That is all that matters to me." "I still have nightmares sometimes," Diana confessed. Not as often as I used to, but sometimes I dream about running through tall grass while people scream behind me. When I wake up, just for a moment, I cannot remember where I am or who I am. But then I hear you breathing beside me, or I hear one of the children moving in their room, and I remember. I am Diana Quinn. I am home. I am safe. I am loved. Always, Dakota said, taking her hand. For the rest of our lives and whatever comes after, you are loved. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Diana turned to her husband. "Play me a song," she asked, "like you used to." Dakota smiled and pulled out the harmonica he still carried in his pocket after all these years. He played the same melodies he had played 15 years ago, songs of longing and hope and home. Diana closed her eyes and listened, and when he finished, she sang the words she had learned over the years, her voice clear and strong and completely her own. When they walked back to town hand in hand, their children were waiting on the porch of the yellow house. Daniel was reading while Dorothy practiced rope tricks, and both looked up when their parents appeared. The simple domestic scene filled Diana with such overwhelming love and gratitude that she felt tears prick her eyes. "You all right, Mama?" Daniel asked, always attuned to her emotions. "I am more than all right," Diana said, climbing the porch steps and pulling both children into her arms despite their laughing protests that they were too old for such things. "I am blessed beyond measure." That night, after the children were in bed, Diana wrote in the journal Dakota had given her all those years ago. She still wrote in it regularly, though now it was less about trauma and loss and more about gratitude and daily life. Tonight she wrote, "15 years ago I thought my life was over. I had lost everything, my family, my voice, my identity, my hope. I was a ghost walking through the world, present but not really living. Then Dakota Quinn saw me, really saw me, and everything changed. He did not try to fix me or pity me or push me to be someone I was not ready to be. He just sat beside me and waited until I was ready to find myself again. Now I have a life I could never have imagined. I have a husband who loves me with a depth and constancy that still takes my breath away. I have children who are healthy and happy and full of potential. I have a home, a community, a purpose. I found my voice again, not just the physical ability to speak, but my true voice, the voice of who I really am. Sometimes I feel guilty that I am so happy when my first family is gone. Would my parents and brother want me to carry grief forever? I do not think so. I think they would want me to live fully, to embrace joy, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. So that is what I do. I live. I love. I remember them by being the best version of myself I can be. To anyone who might read this someday, whether my children or grandchildren or some stranger far in the future, know this. Trauma may mark us, but it does not define us. We are more resilient than we know, more capable of healing than we can imagine. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, we find someone who helps us remember how to be human again. Dakota was that person for me. I hope everyone finds their Dakota, the person who learns to hear everything they never say aloud. She closed the journal and set it aside, then climbed into bed beside her husband. Dakota stirred and automatically reached for her, pulling her close even in his sleep. Diana settled into his familiar warmth and closed her eyes, grateful for every moment, every breath, every heartbeat of this beautiful, hard-won life. Years continued to pass. Daniel did go east for university, studying literature and history, but he came home every summer and eventually returned permanently, taking a job teaching at the growing school in Utica. He married a kind young woman named Sarah, and they gave Dakota and Diana 3 grandchildren. Dorothy never left Montana. She married a rancher named William Harrison when she was 21, and they built a successful horse breeding operation. She gave Dakota and Diana 4 grandchildren, all of them as adventurous and fearless as their mother. As Dakota and Diana entered their 50s, they began to slow down. Dakota handed over most of the daily stable operations to a younger partner, though he still came by every day to work with the horses he loved. Diana continued her work with traumatized children, now training others in the techniques she had developed. She published a small book about her experiences and methods, and it was surprisingly well received, leading to correspondence with doctors and researchers from across the country. One winter evening, when Dakota was 60 and Diana was 58, they sat by the fire in the yellow house that had been their home for over 30 years. The house had been added onto over the years, expanded to accommodate their growing family, but the original main room remained the heart of the home. "Do you ever think about the day we met?" Diana asked, her hair now more silver than gold, but her eyes still the same storm-colored gray-green that had captivated Dakota from the beginning. "All the time," Dakota said. "I remember thinking you looked like a door that had been closed and locked from the inside." "That is exactly what I was," Diana said, "and you picked the lock slowly and patiently until I could open again." "You did most of the work yourself," Dakota said. "I just kept showing up." "Sometimes that is all someone needs," Diana said. "Someone who keeps showing up day after day, not demanding anything, just being present. You gave me space to heal in my own time." They sat quietly for a moment, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Then Diana spoke again. "I had a dream last night. I dreamed I was back on that prairie, running through the tall grass. But this time, when I looked behind me, I saw my family. They were waving goodbye, smiling, giving me permission to move on. When I turned to look ahead, I saw you standing there with the children and grandchildren. And I knew I had made the right choice to keep living, to keep trying, to open my heart again despite the fear." Dakota took her hand, his own now gnarled with age and years of hard work. "I am glad you chose to live. I am glad you chose me. You gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, a life full of love and meaning." "We gave that to each other," Diana corrected gently. "That is what real love does. It does not complete us or fix us. It gives us a safe place to grow and heal and become more fully ourselves." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of long marriage, they heard footsteps on the porch. The door burst open and several grandchildren tumbled in, brought by Daniel and Sarah for a visit, despite the cold weather. "Grandpa, tell us about the horses," demanded 5-year-old Thomas, Daniel's youngest. "Grandma, will you tell us a story?" asked 7-year-old Margaret, Dorothy's middle child. Dakota and Diana exchanged glances and smiled. This was their legacy, not just the children and grandchildren, but the love and security they had built, the safe harbor they had created for everyone who came after them. All of it had started with a silent woman standing outside a mercantile and a cowboy who learned to hear everything she never said aloud. "Come sit by the fire," Diana said, opening her arms, "and we will tell you a story about how sometimes the most important conversations happen without words." As the children settled around them and the fire warmed the room against the Montana winter, Dakota pulled Diana close and began to tell their story. It was a story of loss and healing, of silence and voice, of 2 broken people who had found each other and built something beautiful. It was a love story, yes, but more than that. It was a story of hope, of resilience, of the incredible human capacity to survive trauma and find joy again. And as Diana listened to her husband tell their tale, adding details he forgot and correcting the parts he embellished, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had been given a second life when her first one ended on a prairie long ago. And she had made the most of it, building something lasting and good. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was Diana Quinn, wife of Dakota, mother of Daniel and Dorothy, grandmother to 7 and counting, teacher, helper, survivor, and most importantly, beloved. Her voice had been lost and found again, but she had learned that there were many ways to speak, many ways to be heard. As the evening wore on and the children were reluctantly bundled up and taken home by their parents, Dakota and Diana prepared for bed. They moved around each other with the practiced ease of decades together, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. Before they climbed into bed, Diana went to the shelf where she kept her journals, now dozens of volumes spanning over 30 years. She pulled down the first one, the one Dakota had given her by the creek, and opened it to the first page she had ever written. "You matter to me too." She showed it to Dakota. "Look how far we have come from this." "Look how far you have come," Dakota corrected. "From those 6 words to the woman you are now, the life we have built. I am in awe of you, Diana Quinn. I always have been." Diana closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. Then she took her husband's hand and led him to bed. They lay down together, as they had for over 30 years, and Dakota wrapped his arms around her. "I love you," Diana whispered into the darkness. "I will never get tired of being able to say that out loud." "I love you too," Dakota replied, "and I will never get tired of hearing it. Though I heard it long before you could say it. I heard it in every note you wrote, every glance you gave me, every moment we spent together by the creek. You were always telling me you loved me. I just learned to listen." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, and outside the window, snow began to fall softly over Utica, Montana territory, blanketing the world in peaceful white. Inside the little yellow house that had seen so much love and life, 2 hearts beat in sync, 2 souls intertwined, 2 lives made complete by the simple miracle of being heard. Years later, when Dakota and Diana had both passed on, their children and grandchildren gathered to go through their belongings. They found the journals, every single one carefully preserved. Daniel, now an old man himself, opened the first journal and read his mother's first words to his father. He read about how they met, how they fell in love, how his mother found her voice again through his father's patient listening. "This should be preserved," he said to his own children and grandchildren. "This is not just our family story. This is a story about love and healing that people need to hear." So Diana's journals were carefully transcribed and eventually published, becoming a testament to the power of patient love, of listening with more than just ears, of the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Dakota and Diana Quinn became the story of Utica itself, a legend passed down through generations. And every year on the anniversary of their meeting, the people of Utica would gather by the creek, where Dakota first played his harmonica for a silent woman. They would tell the story again, making sure the young people knew about the couple who had shown them all what real love looked like. Someone would always play harmonica, and someone else would tell about how Dakota Quinn learned to hear everything Diana never said aloud, and how that patience and dedication had saved them both. The creek still flowed, as it always had and always would. And though Dakota and Diana were long gone, their love remained, built into the foundation of the town, woven into the fabric of every family they had touched. They had taken their trauma and their pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something lasting. They had proven that no matter how broken we might feel, there is always hope for healing. We just need to find someone willing to listen with their whole heart. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Dakota and Diana were together still, his arms around her, her voice strong and clear, both of them finally, completely, eternally at peace. Their love story had begun with silence and patience and learned communication. It had grown through trust and vulnerability and shared joy. And it had ended, as all great love stories do, with a legacy that would outlive them both. This was the story of how a mute woman found her voice, how a patient cowboy learned to listen, and how two broken people became whole together. This was the story of Dakota and Diana Quinn of Utica, Montana Territory, who proved that love, real love, hears everything that matters, whether it is spoken aloud or not.